Despite his outspoken critics, FDR knew the economy had improved, but not as much as he'd hoped for. And so he launched, with the help of his humanitarian wife Eleanor, the Second New Deal. Mrs. Roosevelt traveled the country from coast to coast, seeing the poverty and suffering, urging her husband to provide even more help to the needy. She became a kindly symbol of hope for the downtrodden, who regarded her as a personal friend. Thousands of children wrote to her asking for help. FDR convinced Congress to pass more legislation to spur the economy, including a second Agricultural Adjustment Act, rewarding farmers that practice soil conservation and compensating farmers who cut production of soil-depleting crops like cotton and wheat. The Resettlement Administration loaned money to tenant farmers so they could buy their own land and established camps for migrant workers. The Second New Deal's most ambitious program was the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The WPA created more than 8 million jobs from 1935 to 1943 for a great many unskilled workers and professionals. The WPA constructed 850 airports, built or repaired 650,000 miles of America's roads, sewed more than 300 million articles of clothing for the needy, and erected 110,000 libraries, schools, and hospitals. Artists, authors, and musicians found work in the WPA too, painting murals on public buildings, writing, performing, and composing. A National Youth Administration was also created to provide aid and part-time employment for students in need. The Second New Deal also helped reform labor laws with the passage of the Wagner Act, which supported workers' rights to form unions, and the establishment of the National Labor Relations Board to prevent unfair labor practices. From 1933 to 1941, the number of union workers rose from 3 million to 8. Congress also passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, requiring minimum wages and maximum hours for workers. Despite the administration's pro-labor policies, strikes were prevalent and often led to violence. On Memorial Day 1937, 10 people lost their lives at the Republic Steel Strike in Chicago. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Second New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935. For the first time, Americans over 65 years of age and their spouses had old age insurance. Jobless workers got unemployment compensation, and families with dependent children and the disabled received aid. In 1935, only about 30% of American farms had electricity, so Congress, with Roosevelt's urging, set up the Rural Electrification Administration. 10 years later, 45% of rural America had electric power. With widespread support from organized labor, minorities, and the public at large, FDR was re-elected as president in 1936. His victory marked the first time most African Americans voted for a Democratic Party candidate. With Eleanor Roosevelt's prompting, Roosevelt appointed the first female ambassador and several women federal judges. Frances Perkins became the first female Secretary of Labor, and Mary McLeod Bethune was appointed head of the Office of Minority Affairs in the National Youth Administration, becoming the first African-American woman to head a federal agency. Meanwhile, Mrs. Roosevelt defied the Daughters of the American Revolution, publicly resigning her membership when the DAR refused to let Marian Anderson sing in Washington, D.C.'s Constitution Hall because of her color. Instead, Eleanor Roosevelt arranged for the concert to be held on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. In the midst of labor unrest, poverty, and hardship, Americans still managed to find fun at the movies. For just a quarter, they could forget their troubles in one of more than 15,000 picture palaces. Radio, too, entertained a weary America. Practically every home had a radio, and families gathered to laugh at Burns and Allen and thrill to the drama of Orson Welles' Mercury Theater on the Air. By 1939, the nation seemed to be on the road to economic recovery, and Congress cut back on the New Deal unemployment programs, since it had gone deeply into debt, providing jobs and aid to Americans. The economy started to improve, but the Republican Party blocked any further relief efforts. Meanwhile, FDR and America, despite wishing to remain neutral, began to realize that war was inevitable in Europe, and very soon it became a reality. Ironically, when America finally entered World War II, her massive investment in manufacturing guns, airplanes, tanks, and ships would finally lift the country out of the Great Depression.